The Triad region remains one of North Carolina's most attractive housing markets, offering a perfect blend of affordability, quality of life, and economic opportunity. As you consider purchasing a home in 2025, the Sharp Mortgage Team is ready to help. With median home prices significantly lower than the national average, first-time homebuyers and families continue to find excellent value in the Triad. And with programs like NC Housing Financing Down Payment Assistance, your new home may be more affordable than you think. Or if your holiday bills have been stacking up, the Sharp Mortgage Team can help you consolidate your debts and put you on a successful road in 2025. Call them today and they'll advise you on the best strategy. Call Ashley and the folks at the Sharp Mortgage Team at 336-575-9448 today for a no-obligation conversation that could be your best decision all year.
This is the Triad Podcast Network.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of Tariff Talk here on the Triad. You like that? Yeah. We are with our certified financial planner, Jennifer Johnson. She is with Three Magnolias Financial Advisors in Winston-Salem. I kind of had a feeling this would be our topic today. I mean, there's a lot. There's always so many different things we can jump into when it comes to money, but this is what everybody is talking about. This has been one of the big things that has been a priority for the new administration with Trump is tariffs on foreign countries, and we want to have the conversation about what that does to impact people here in the U.S. And how does it affect the market? How might it affect your finances, your pocketbook? Right. So that's what we're going to get into today. Jennifer, first of all, though, I thought I'd just ask a very simple question, but maybe not a very simple answer. But what is a tariff? I'd like to ask that to begin.
That's a great thing to start with, because there may be folks that don't really know what that is, but it's in many ways that you could think of it as like a tax or a charge that our government levies on goods that are brought into the country to be sold. And if you're like me, most of the things that you go out to buy, it's a little bit unusual to see something fully made in the U.S., right? I mean, that's a little bit of an outlier. Most things are imported. We've learned over the years with globalization. So a lot of the stuff you buy would be in that category of things that are imported in the United States. So, a tariff would be something our government would place on there, an extra charge, if you will, on those goods coming into the country to be sold.
So is it accurate to say that anytime something, a good or a part of a product that is being made, anytime it crosses a border, if it's coming from a country where a tariff exists, and we've heard Canada and Mexico and China as countries being mentioned when it comes to the tariffs that are being put into place, anytime something crosses that border to get to the U.S., that's when the tariff hits, correct?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. And that's a good point too. It is country specific, right? Like, so it's not a general everything that comes in, but that source, matters. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks whose whole job are figuring out, like you said, like parts of things, come from different places and how they're routed and those sorts of things that, that try to maybe avoid some of those tariffs. If you can. What's interesting, like, I think in the past, reasons that tariffs have been put in place, of course, would be to sort of punish, someone that you don't agree with, their actions, an enemy, if you will. But what's interesting here is like our border countries, I don't know that we would think about them as enemies. I certainly don't think of Canadians, as enemies. I don't know if some people might, but I don't. This is just an interesting one because, it's not necessarily a retaliation like you might think of when Russia, attacked Ukraine, tariffs on their goods. it's been interesting to sort of understand the Trump administration's motives, for these tariffs, because it also can be, of course, protecting U.S. goods, right? So if you want to favor, products made in your own country over those that are brought in, you can put a tariff on similar products that are made outside the U.S. to protect a U.S. maker of something. That's another reason that those are done.
Yeah, and tariffs go all the way back to the lead up to the Revolutionary War. I mean,
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
the most famous was the
right.
Boston Tea Party, right? I
That's
mean
true.
that
Yeah,
that was about tea being imported from Britain. Yeah, I mean this goes back, and it's always been a part of foreign relations.
right,
And sometimes, I think in this case, I mean, look, I'll say this at the beginning: we are not here to debate the rights and the wrongs of policies. Our job here on this podcast is to talk about the things that are happening and how they will impact
right,
could impact you, the listener. So,
right.
but I think in this case, some of the tariffs are to strong arm
Mm,
countries to get what you want.
yeah, yeah,
Securing the
sure.
borders with troops
Right,
and things like that. So,
right,
um, the interesting thing to me is in terms of how that could affect companies or costs of
right,
creation of products and services here in the States is sometimes, and maybe the automobile industry is the best example of this. Sometimes don't
right,
parts have to cross borders several times before finished products are
right.
done, and then it could be
That's a good point.
every single time it incurs a tariff. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that could happen. Yeah, the auto industry has definitely been one that's been impacted by these, most recent round or, threats, if you will, of tariffs. I mean, right now they really haven't been put in place, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
this talk of they could be put there. And what does that mean, for companies? Because you're hitting on it, right? If you're making something, here in the United States, a car or whatnot, and your parts, your inputs come from outside the US, then obviously that's going to squeeze your profit, right? Because, if that costs 25% more, then you got a tough decision to make. Like, do you raise the price of that item and pass that along to the consumer? Does that just cut into your own profit? Is it a combination of the two? Because inevitably, like that cost has to be paid by someone, right? And it's going to either be in that end consumer, that product, the consumer is paying for all of that, or the business is not as profitable. But there's an added cost certainly on that final good.
Yeah, so let's talk about the impacts that it could have on people. And I'm glad you made that clarification that in the case of like Canada and Mexico, the tariffs haven't happened yet. They've been
Right.
threatened, they've been talked about, but it hasn't actually gone into place yet.
Right.
But is that the biggest impact that people will see? Is because it will force companies of a certain industry more to make their products to because of these taxes
Yeah.
essentially
Yeah.
on their imports, then they could potentially, as a way to protect their bottom line, they could potentially have to increase the purchase cost of their products.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so even though these things haven't even, happened yet, we were told, I think late last week, that effective Tuesday or what would have been yesterday, these tariffs were going to go into place. And as soon as that became public news, on Friday, the stock market was down sharply and then opened on Monday also sharply. And it's for that very reason, Adam. I think that's a good point. So why would that be? And the reason is because all of a sudden things are going to cost more, right? And as we've discussed before at a personal level, the consumer, the individual, the family, only has so much money to spend, right? And so if all of a sudden things cost a whole lot more, particularly gas prices, have been up, and other of these items that that you can't avoid spending money on a lot of times, but things that are going up, you're obviously can only purchase so many things, right? So the concern is that'll really hurt consumer demand. The consumer will be really stretched. and also hurt profitability on the company level. If they can't afford to raise those end prices, they're obviously making less money. And then making less money affects their stock price, right? So that's the reason that we saw, oh my goodness, markets are really down. What was interesting on Monday is when we heard that those were going to be postponed at least a month, with Mexico and Canada, is that the market went from down, I think it was 600 or 700 points that morning, and it was briefly even positive shortly after that. So it's been interesting to see the incredible movements, of the stock market over that time. And I think also it's caused a great deal of concern, from clients, and certainly business owners too, about what does this mean for me? How does this affect my business? And really, how does this affect the larger economy? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's some examples that I found.
Okay.
There's there was a story in the New York Times about referencing how some specific industries could be impacted here and the cost of this. So in summary, in the auto industry, a single car may pass the U.S.-Canada border 8 times before it hits a dealer's lot. And this is reported by the New York Times.
Yeah.
And it says, under the tariffs that were proposed, prices for U.S. car buyers will rise approximately $3,000 on average as a result of that.
Car, probably, right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great example on that car. I mean, that's a big difference, $3,000.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Food was another one too. So here's this one. So from the same area, Mexico, another country that has been talked about in terms of levying a tariff. Mexico supplies over 80% of U.S. avocados.
You were going to say avocados, of course.
Yep. And so, and there's fruits, there's vegetables, there's meat that are imported from Canada and Mexico. And so, so when you go to the grocery store, I mean, we're already talking about the increased cost of eggs and things like that, but this could only make things go up higher when you're looking to make that Super Bowl guacamole.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, if you think about like food cost, I mean, you've got to eat, right? And you're talking even about like grocery store prices, not even like going out to eat. So, if your food and your gas prices are up, people are going to spend more on that. Even if your industry does not import, if your end consumer has to spend more on food and gas, they don't have as much to buy of your product, even if it's made completely here in North Carolina. And so that's why you see a general sort of negative impact, on the market, kind of across. I mean, it was extremely broad, the impact to the stock market. I think it was only maybe some energy companies that were more positive, that were at all positive when this hit the news first. That's a great point.
Yeah. So let me ask you about the stock market part of this. You mentioned that when the news came out that this was being that this could be a reality, you said that the stock market reacted in a way that was somewhat significant. So why would that have happened? Why did we see a dip in the market when this became something that could happen?
Yeah, well, and so we have to remember the stock market is a forward-looking thing, right? I mean, when you buy a piece of a company, shares of that company called stocks, you're buying those shares because you think that price is going to go up or they're going to pay more dividend in the future. And they're doing that because they're growing, right? They're going to sell more in the future than they are now. And so your value goes up. And so the market is always going to be a forward-looking thing. So when it says, "Oh, this could be coming down the pipe at us," it's like, "Oh, we have to adjust our expectations about growth or profitability on these companies," and so it immediately responds, negatively to the possibility of just what we described earlier. In that, if you're running a business, you're making cars, and you realize, oh my gosh, it's going to cost me $3,000 more per car, and I make God knows how many per year. I mean, that's a real negative. It either it's a negative, I guess, in two ways. I mean, one, that for most of these places, they won't be able to pass all those costs on to the consumer. As we just described earlier, there's only so much the consumer can bear. And then secondly, even if you are able to pass, some of that on, your profitability is still going to be down as a company. There's also the fear that if these go into place, that it could cause a recession too, because the consumer is so pinched by that, right? And or scared, right? Like scared of what might happen, and they stop spending as they normally would, because it did inject a lot of fear, into people. And those sorts of fears, sometimes cause them to like rein in, purchases or spending, or, doing things because they're worried about how they're going to pay for the food bill, right? Because you hear all these stories about how much it could, things, avocados could go up, right?
New year, new you, right? Well, how about new home? Maybe your focus in 2025 is
buying, selling, or investing in real estate. Maybe it's purchasing your first home or building wealth for your family. Whatever your goals are, the agents at the Ginther Group can help. It's never too early to begin working with Blake Ginther and his team, who have been a trusted resource to the Triad community since 2010. To reach Blake and his team at the Ginther Group, just visit theginthergroup.com or give them a call, 336-283-8689.
Life is full of celebrations, birthdays, holidays, life milestones, and so much more. And who has been helping generations of families celebrate these events? Our friends at Dewey's Bakery. And even if you aren't planning for something in the near future, you don't have to wait to enjoy something savory and delicious from Dewey's. Maybe you just need something to get you through your Mondays. Drop by every Monday for a free Cake Square Day. No purchase necessary. Just come celebrate the start of a new week. So, if you're hearing this ad on a Monday and you're in your car, reset that GPS and get to one of their 3 Triad locations immediately in Winston-Salem at Thruway and Renolda Manor, plus one in Greensboro at Friendly Shopping Center. And any day of the week, you can find the perfect item with fast and easy ordering options at local.deweys.com. Plus, Dewey's does so much to help celebrate our community. To date, they've given back over $4 million to local schools, churches, and other nonprofits. Your next celebration isn't complete without something special from Dewey's Bakery. Dewey's. Celebrate every day.
Do any industries, I mean, I guess maybe it would
benefit?
just be do any benefit from this? And I guess maybe the easy answer would be anybody that does all of their business and all of their goods within our borders, right?
Yeah, to some degree, yes. I think energy prices gas prices were up, so some of the gas or energy companies, benefit from that a little bit. I think, like you said, companies that make and produce solely in the United States could benefit from that, though. Those were also down on those same fears that we could go into a recession. So spending in general is down. So that's one reason. You might think, well, if you're a U.S. company, you make and sell here, shouldn't that be a good thing for you if your competitors now pay more? I think the challenge is like you just described with a lot of U.S. based companies, a lot of their stuff comes from outside the United States to do what they're doing. And then secondly, if the consumer here is so, constrained by the just general prices being up, they're going to have less capacity to buy all sorts of good and services, right? Not just stuff, but like services. You just don't have the money for it, right?
So what, other than just being even more diligent and with their money and what comes in and what goes out, what can people do to try to combat this if in fact some of this stuff happens? And if I'm looking for a new car, I might have to pay more for it, or I'm going to get my produce bill. What I spend on produce at the grocery store is going to go up. Those kind of things.
Right. Yeah, I did hear a few people say they had stockpiled tequila in anticipation, this coming. I think it's too late for that. So I would not recommend people do that. I think two things. I mean, one, I think there's still a great possibility that we don't see tariffs of any significant degree, that this is more a negotiating tactic. We talk about when Mexico in particular, there's a lot of concern about like the drug, illegal drugs, that come out of Mexico. And it may be that Trump is trying to curb the inflow of those drugs. And it may be that, the fear of this, will get the concessions, he wants, whether it be border security that you mentioned. And I guess that's related as well to the drugs crossing the border or something else, with Canada. The way that Trump tends to operate, and to your point, this is not a criticism or affirmation, just an observation, and to help us understand what's happening is, he tends to come in hard, right? Like the art of the deal, and then see how far you can push somebody and then kind of back off to sort of get what he ultimately wants. I think one of the most important things is to not panic, right? Like a lot of times, as we talked about before, when things affect the market, and particularly the stock market, that can be more volatile. We see people start to make drastic changes, in their investment strategies, and rarely is that a good thing, right? I mean, you're in general better off to decide like where you need to be kind of long term, the risk you're comfortable with, and just kind of be patient when you have extreme volatility, because things can change so quickly. Like I mentioned, Monday, you start off drastically down, within a few hours, the market's up. So I think it's important, to keep that in mind and not make any like drastic jumps, in your portfolio, because that's a tough one, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's like you said, the headline comes out and everybody's talking about tariffs and what it could do to what it costs to buy things here, or what it's going to do to companies and their profitability or their earnings. And people react off of that. But the reality is nothing's happened yet.
That's right.
There's about another month left until like a deadline in which these could be imposed, some sort of negotiation could or compromise could happen. So yeah,
right.
I think this is another example of all these different things that happen in our country or worldwide that affect the stock market one way or the other. And the advice always seems to be, hey, don't do anything drastic based on one singular day.
That's right. And to your point, tariffs have been around for a long time. It's not anything new. I think it's just maybe the abruptness of the story, that came out, and sort of the surprise. I think also there's more positives than negatives for the stock market with most of what Trump wants to propose as far as policy, right? Like lower corporate regulation, lower corporate tax rates, like those are all good things. Tariffs are the one area that could be a negative, right, for growth. But I will say, I think Trump is probably maybe one of the most pro-business presidents we've maybe ever had, right? And probably pays more attention to the stock market than, any president I can think of. So when we think about, I think what's hard here is we don't always fully understand the motivation, behind this particular, targeting Mexico and Canada, over the weekend. Like, where did that come from? I think that's, that sort of surprise too, caught a lot of people off guard, and not understanding that, I think makes people a bit nervous. I do think, at the end of the day, I think the effort really is to put us in a stronger position economically, right? And I do think this administration will care, if these policies drive up inflation, squeeze the consumer, and that sort of thing. So So I think there's no reason to panic, I guess, is what I would say. Like, I think you're gonna see some volatility, but I don't think there's any reason to assume from this that everything's going to fall apart.
Yeah, it could very well be a tactic and not an overall strategy.
That's what I personally, believe for all the reasons I mentioned. I think that is a good point, though, that people should prepare for costs to start to go back up. I don't think it would be anything like what we saw during COVID. We saw such extreme inflation during that time, but I would expect prices to, go higher. The other thing, which is a little bit outside the scope maybe of today's discussion, but the immigration policies also could result in less labor and higher wage prices, which is kind of a similar thing as tariffs. Those costs start to go up for, the people doing the work, less workers. That's just another reason that I think people, you do need to be prepared with all the things we've talked about before, making sure you're watching your budget and what you're actually spending, because a lot of these may not be that noticeable on an individual level, right? Like if cherry tomatoes was one of the examples I heard, that we import like 80% of our cherry tomatoes or something this makes you aware, where stuff comes from, I think, which is interesting. But you may not notice that price has gone up a little bit, but I think it's if across the board prices are creeping up on you, all of a sudden the budget's busted.
Yep. Yeah, so it's important for people not just to pay attention to what they see when they go shopping in terms of the cost of things. It's important to say, okay, well, what industries could end up paying more? What is this going to do to businesses domestically in terms of their costs, whether it's labor or imports? Businesses, their goal is to remain they're not okay with losing profitability. Their shareholders don't like that, right?
No,
and so they're going to do what they have to, in most cases, to remain just as profitable as they were before. So those costs get absorbed somewhere.
That's right.
That's right. What we're trying to maybe pass along to folks in terms of how to pay attention to these things.
Yeah. Hopefully it helps people understand a little bit, like, why does this matter? Particularly like you said about a company that maybe doesn't import. What's the negative for them? What's the negative for, a consumer that maybe works at a U.S. based manufacturer? Shouldn't they see this as a positive thing? Maybe, but there's, these other things that are concerning too, like maybe all your other costs, go up. And what does that mean for our economy? I mean, the positive thing is that I mentioned earlier, there was concern that this might tip us into recession, right? With all these tariffs. I did see one economist say, even if the tariffs went in place, it wouldn't necessarily tip us into recession. It would definitely mean slower growth. It might mean GDP growth instead of 2%, it's 1%, for example. But it's not maybe as devastating, I guess, as what it might appear. It does matter. In no way am I saying it doesn't matter. But it's something to keep an eye on and just kind of be prepared, that things might cost a little bit more. I think gas prices have already gone up a bit. Hopefully this will not turn out to be as big of an impact on us as it could be, but it'll be an interesting year. We're going to have a lot to talk about on podcasts. So I hope people will stay tuned, because I'm sure we'll have something else to talk about next month.
Yes, we will. And then next month we might know whether these tariffs happened or not, and so we can potentially continue part of this conversation. But
on to China at that point, right?
Could be. Well, whatever happens, there's we want to make sure that people know how they could be impacted in their daily lives and their daily finances, and so if they need a certified financial planner, Jennifer and her team at Three Magnolias are a great option for a group to talk to. So Jennifer, if they want to do that, how can they find you?
It's out online. We're Three Magnolias Financial Advisors, all spelled out. And I know you do a good job putting that in the show notes. You can give us a call. We're local. 336-701-1600 is our number. And we just love to hear from folks.
All right. That is Jennifer Johnson with our first, and who knows, maybe it won't be our last episode of Tariff Talk.
Tariff Talk. Yeah. You may have to rename the podcast.
Yeah. All right. Well, who knows, if we're going for SEO, we'll just put the word tariff in there many times, because that's what people are searching for. So it'll up our SEO. So Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Securities offered through Private Client Services, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Three Magnolias Financial Advisors, located at 110 Oakwood Drive, Suite 480, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 27103. Three Magnolias Financial Advisors and Private Client Services are not affiliated. Private Client Services is under separate ownership from any other named entity. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. All economic and performance information is historical and not indicative of future results. The market indices discussed are unmanaged. Additional risks are associated with international investing, such as currency fluctuations, political and economic stability, and differences in accounting standards. The views depicted in this material are for information purposes only, and not necessarily those of Private Client Services. They should not be considered specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Neither Private Client Services nor any of its representatives may give legal or tax advice.
This is the Triad Podcast Network.